I've been an enterprise business architect at Schroders Investment Management for coming up to the past 4 years. Prior to that, I was in a business architecture role in another firm. And I guess these most recent, including my current roles, I guess are reflections of my career journey, which started in management consulting and took me in a roundabout way through process improvement, operating model design. And I think the thread which went through all of them, and latterly working on a global transformation project for a global bank. And I think what all those experiences had in common for me was to reinforce the importance of common understanding between business stakeholders as to what terms mean and how to really communicate and collaborate together in a meaningful way. And I think as a result of all of those kind of experiences earlier on in my career, I kind of realized that oftentimes that was the make or break between a successful business transformation and maybe a less successful one.
I definitely.
And hence wanted to become more interested in and specialize in this growing field of business architecture. So hence I'm here. I'm absolutely delighted to speak at this business architecture conference. I guess I should really start with a big thank you to the organizing committee of this conference. Thank you so much for having me. I'm conscious that the materials that you've heard already and are going to hear in the presentations after mine are an absolute feast of ideas around business architecture for a group of architecture leaders. And so I guess you're probably going to have about a Netflix season's worth of content. And so I guess in terms of the contribution that I can make, you're probably going to expect me to get to the point quite quickly, to hopefully tell some useful and relevant and possibly entertaining anecdotes. I'm hoping to provide some food for thought. And I guess I'm really here to talk about the connection between business architecture and organizational culture. And the fundamental reason that I wanted to talk about this subject is because I guess on the scale of perhaps professional enjoyment, I would put the considerations of organizational culture to be at the end of the scale called perhaps eat your vegetables. And the reason I say that is because there's a difference in my mind between being the business architect and scaling the architecture. And I guess I'll maybe start with the first of those two models. Being the architect, I guess, is one that we're all used to, and it's about nothing. We all enjoy nothing more than working on capability maps, working on value streams, working on the conceptual equivalents, I guess, perhaps in other architecture disciplines. And we love nothing more than opening our knowledge base or our enterprise architecture toolset and showing genuine value-adding insight to our business and our IT stakeholders. And there's a recent study that shows, in fact, that being the architect is actually the natural sweet spot, no surprises really, for most professional business architects. And it's great for our companies, it's fun, it helps to grow our careers, and there is absolutely nothing wrong at all with being an architect. I mean, that's I guess partly why we're all here. But what I wanted to kind of consider in this presentation was about scaling the architecture. And scaling the architecture is actually something different. Scaling the architecture is about senior leadership and the wider organization around you really buying into, really understanding, really having the ability to conceptualize and apply the business architecture framework that you're building for your organization. It's about senior leaders buying into the approaches and the frameworks and the models that you're able to produce, not just down to your own personal powers of persuasion, but because you've actually got an army of supporters around the organization vouching on your behalf for you behind the scenes. And that's actually one of the best signs of success of business architecture in action, is that it's actually not something that's confined and specialized to the business architecture practice, but it's actually something that's federated and that it's scaled. And so actually the kind of topic that I really want to talk about in this presentation is about what it takes for organizations to accept evolutionary ideas about how to transform their ways of working. And that is something a little perhaps different to just being the architect. Absolutely nothing wrong with the former, but there's so much to be gained from the latter. And what I wanted to talk about in this presentation, I'll do some quick introductions, I'll define some key terms. This is a presentation about organizational culture, so there might be a picture of an iceberg at some point. But then I want to get through that so that I'm clear about the terms I'm using. I'll talk a little bit about the business architecture some successes that we've enjoyed in our organization, also some of the challenges that we've had. And then I'll spend the real content talking through the approaches that we have taken to trying to influence organizational culture to support our efforts in business architecture. And I guess just a couple of quick things then before I jump off this introductory page is, I guess, maybe almost a quick disclaimer on the title here, and almost around the point of emphasis of how to read the title of this presentation, because I was almost conscious, having submitted this before the conference started, that it might appear as if I was claiming that we had established the right company culture to apply business architecture, and I think that might be a little presumptuous on my part. It was certainly not what I meant at the time. I think the point of emphasis really in the title is about establishing, or trying to establish, the right company culture to apply business architecture, because I'm simply a practitioner looking for ways to try and not only be the architect but also scale the architecture in our organization. And so I'm hoping that this really amounts to a series of lessons learned and practical stories that hopefully those listening and dialing in can take something away from and discuss and think about how to maybe apply in their own situations and business ecosystems. And I guess also, just to come back to the point I was making about the what it takes to take on and scale, and for organizations to really accept brand new evolutionary ideas about ways of working. I guess I was thinking of some real examples of that just to bring that to life. And I guess just kind of thinking back and thinking in different scenarios and points in time where that's come up. I mean, it's things like the medical industry accepting that hand washing is a good idea. And I think perhaps for those of us who are maybe familiar with that story, as straightforward as that might appear in the present day, that was not a given, and it was not taken for granted that was a good idea to begin with. I guess you think about examples like GDPR being applied in a data governance and data privacy context, and I guess there's probably differing views about the value and the I guess the results of regulation, which is absolutely important in the interests of consumer data privacy. I guess it's also switching industries and thinking about why the Oakland A's adopted sabermetrics before any other team in Major League Baseball. So these are all things which I guess in the rearview mirror appear like, well, of course these are things that were adopted because they make absolute sense in hindsight. At the time, they were maybe a little less straightforward. And I guess I often think of parallels between some of those examples or some aspects of those examples, and sometimes try to apply business architecture in a new way in a new organization that maybe hasn't had much exposure to it before. So those are some of the reasons why I think company culture is such an important consideration when you think about business architecture, and really why I wanted to come along and share a few thoughts today. So if I could possibly go to the next slide, please. Thank you very much. So just very, very quick intro to myself. I've been working for 17 years in business architecture and transformation. I guess I was just kind of talking at the beginning about some of my career experiences. I've worked at Schroders since 2018. I'm a certified business architect. I have got a great deal of value of being involved with the Business Architecture Guild, and I'll talk about some of that. And I've referenced some of the Business Architecture Guild's materials in this presentation. I'm a contributor to the Business Architecture Body of Knowledge, the BizBot Guide, through my membership of the Financial Services Industry Model Reference Working Group. And yeah, it's a great opportunity to collaborate, to learn, and to share knowledge with other business architects as part of that. So I'm very happy to answer questions at the end of this session. But yeah, that's a quick introduction to myself. If I could go on to the following slide about Schroders. So just a very quick, again, this is really for context, so that I can hopefully bring some examples to life later in the presentation. So Schroders, we're a 200-year-old financial services organization headquartered in London. We're in the FTSE 100, so we're one of the largest UK listed companies. We have about 5,500 people in about 34 countries. We have about $1 trillion of assets under management. I guess as an overview for those perhaps outside the industry, as a firm, we invest invest money on behalf of institutional clients, such as pension funds, and we also invest on behalf of retail clients who buy units in our retail funds, which are designed for a variety of investment needs. We also have a wealth management business where we invest on behalf of high net worth individuals, family offices, and charities. We're a client-centric organisation, and that's why I put the quote from our chief executive, Peter Harrison, in the middle of the page. That's him pictured there. And I guess, some of the things which might kind of bring that particular quote to life. So we've recently made a number of key acquisitions that are now in the public domain that reflect our really pressing current priorities in areas like sustainable investing, private assets, and growing our solutions capabilities to meet our client needs. So that's a very quick overview about Schroders, about the firm that I work for. If I just go on a couple of slides in terms of definition. So first of all, and I'm conscious that for those that are kind of doing the Netflix binge of all of these presentations back to back, which I think is a fantastic way to consume the content, it's possible that there will be different definitions as to what this great discipline means across the course of the conference. The one I've used here is the one that's in the BizBook guide. It comes from the Federation of Enterprise Architecture Professional Organizations. It's a pretty simple definition. I guess I can quickly read it out. It's business architecture represents holistic, multi-dimensional business views of capabilities, end-to-end value delivery, information and organizational structure, and the relationship among these business views and strategies, products, policies, initiatives, and stakeholders. I guess what I really like about this definition, and I've spoken about it externally before, is that it invites curiosity, and it invites curiosity, I guess, from the get-go, and immediately when we've shared this, with stakeholders internally. So what are business capabilities? What does end-to-end value delivery actually mean? And it invites that curiosity and starts that conversation almost immediately. I guess the beyond the simple definition of what a business architecture actually means, we're also kind of quick to kind of follow it up also with the value proposition of business architecture as well, which is about providing that abstract representation of an enterprise and the ecosystem in which it operates, so that you can analyze it in such a way as to deliver different strategy execution outcomes. Some of the ways in which we do tend to use these materials formally when we're introducing the concept of business architecture to stakeholders. In terms of maybe some of the more snappy ways that we refer to the definition and the ways to think about it. So, for example, we refer to business architecture as a single connected business language that helps us to accelerate and de-risk change. And those, I'm conscious there's a difference between a formal definition of the discipline and some of the ways to refer to or to think about it. But I guess these are some ways to maybe think about the scope of what's in play here. I guess one of the other questions that typically comes up when looking at a definition like this is why business processes are not in there. But I guess that's maybe perhaps a common reaction, having spoken to other business architects as well. So I've somewhat, I didn't want to rush through this definition, but I guess I wanted to spend possibly less time defining this particular term, and maybe a little more time, perhaps on the next slide, looking at the definition of culture. And I did promise an iceberg, and here it is. I guess there were kind of three points really I wanted to make on this page about what is culture. And I guess just to start with, Oxford English Dictionary, what are we talking about here? And I guess at the top there, it's the ideas, the customs, and the social behaviour of a particular people or society. And what I like about that as a definition is that it's kind of acknowledging almost immediately that the culture is something that's fluid. It's referring to customs and behaviour, and it's about as it refers to there are people or a society in action. And so it's already talking about something quite dynamic, and I guess then it starts to force. There are questions from all walks of life about what culture means. I guess in this context, the key questions that are maybe interesting in terms of relating it back to a topic like business architecture in a corporate sense is why does culture change, and how does culture change? And then I guess that leads on to this iceberg picture in the middle of the page. So this is from somebody called Edward Twitchell Hall. It's a fairly famous picture. Oh, if we could possibly just go back to the iceberg slide. Thank you. I'm just going to spend a moment or two just explaining a couple of key points there. Thank you. And for anyone that's not seen it before, the point really is just like an iceberg, the visible parts of culture. So the vision, the mission, the policies, the strategies, external presentations, possibly like this one. These are all explicit representations of culture. But the real mass, the real significance of culture are not really visible at all. They're below the waterline, and that's about relationships. It's about feelings. It's about values and norms. It's about those unwritten rules. And it also, the bottom there, you can see it's also about people's fundamental needs for things like safety, about feeling safe. And those are really important parts of culture. So I guess before I just go touch on the point at the bottom of the page, what I find interesting about these first two items about the definition and this iceberg model. The iceberg model is interesting because it helps us it gives us a map to start thinking about those questions of why culture changes and how culture changes. Because it allows you to start looking at the factors that might allow these things to start happening. And the other interesting thing about them is that they refer to culture as about people in a collective sense and not an individual sense. But what I think is maybe interesting about why and how culture change is that this now brings me on to the point at the bottom of this page, which is that organizational culture is often best viewed as a trailing indicator of not really groups of people, but actually individuals and what individuals value and the way in which individuals behave. And I guess in terms of thinking, going back to the start of this presentation for a second and thinking about not only being the architects, but about scaling the architecture, what we're really talking about the power of corporate culture in terms of the ripple effect and building that army of support for your business architecture practice and your business architecture efforts is that by influencing individuals, that can have a ripple effect in building the unwritten rules, the values and norms, the attitudes and feelings about your business architecture effort, which ultimately carries your influence far beyond your direct interactions with your business stakeholders. So there's enormous power in organizational culture. And I guess one perspective, therefore, in terms of viewing culture is that it's actually a method of communication by considering it explicitly. And I guess that's a really important thing to bear in mind when we're thinking about the success of a business architecture practice and the role that organizational culture might play. So I might go on to the next slide now, please. So I'll come back to culture in a second, but I guess now I want to kind of almost come back to the start again and just to kind of restart with business architecture can enable strong business outcomes. And I'm hoping that statement, I'm on safe ground with this audience in terms of making that statement. And I guess I wanted to, before going into some of the specific cultural actions or steps that we're taking, I just wanted to spend a second talking about, in a business architecture context, what are the things that we're actually doing as a firm right now? Because I think that's important to bear in mind as I go through the rest of the content. So I'll just call out some quick examples here. So starting from the left, so in terms of investment take on, so this is where we are essentially onboarding new business. And an example of that is one in which we have in fact used our business architecture extensively in not only our business as usual investment take on business processes, but in fact we've used it in the largest investment take on ever performed within our industry. And that happened about 3 years ago, where our client, Lloyds Banking Group, asked Schroders to take on £80 billion worth of wealth and insurance assets. And the project SWIFT that resulted, like I said, it was the largest investment take on ever. We used our business capability model at the start of that program to assess the cross-functional impact of taking on that amount of new business, and where we might, for example, have to introduce new instrument types, new trading activity, new third-party agreements. And rather than breaking that down into silos, which is perhaps a risk when timescales are short and the priority is very high, it allowed the business to take that cross-functional view and really to be able to plan in a different way than we otherwise would have done. And I think that's one of the kind of key foundations which has gained trust in terms of business architecture in our organization. In terms of things like product development, so we've used the concept of value streams to streamline the way in which we've brought investment products to life. In our asset management, so in terms of our core investment asset management part of our business, we have used value streams and capabilities to improve and prioritize where we need to make improvement efforts from a change portfolio perspective. We have used our business architecture framework pretty extensively in terms of helping us to understand the impact of new regulations as a regulated financial services firm. And I guess I made a quick reference earlier to some of the acquisitions that Schroders has made recently. And we have absolutely and are currently using our business architecture framework to help us to align the different business models, not only of our own, but with the strengths and great potential that different acquisitions bring to our now combined and collective business. And it's been, as I referred to in terms of that single connected business language that helps us to accelerate and de-risk change, the business architecture is a great way of being able to compare side by side what's our legacy way of doing it, what's the legacy way that our new partners are performing a particular business activity, and how can we really realize the best of both worlds in bringing that new operating model to life. So those are all the great things about being the architect, and some of the strengths and the really good things. I guess in every presentation there is a but, and we go on to the next slide now. And I suppose I did feel that almost for balance, I had to introduce the almost the greatest hits of the things that you never want to hear as a business architect. And I guess I almost wince in not wanting to read the things out on this page. It's possible that perhaps business architects watching this, reading this, listening to this will look at some of these and might recognize that these kind of statements have come up before. I won't say all of them have come from my own organization. One or two might have. Some come from things I've heard from other places. But yeah, it is a value stream of process. I don't really think I understand this. I think we should try something else. I don't immediately get it. I think I'll create my own business architecture. Information and data, they're pretty much the same thing, aren't they? And then possibly, the all-time number one, why is my department not shown on the capability map? And these things come up. And I guess I don't mean to sound dismissive of these questions at all, because in fact, that when these questions come up, they're actually great opportunities to help the colleague, stakeholder. They're coming from a place of trying to understand things better. So it is actually, in fact, a little unfair to colour these in red maybe on the page, because in fact, these are really great opportunities to build a bridge and to build some understanding. I think the risk of these questions really, and the reason I've coloured them in this way, is because you can be sure that just as much as these questions might be surfaced in meetings or in interactions that you're in directly, you can also be sure that for every bit, like going back to the iceberg picture, for every time you hear one of these questions directly to you, it will probably be asked 10 times the amount in interactions that you're not involved in, and you don't have an opportunity to correct the record or to help to build that understanding. And so actually there is a risk with business architecture that if it's perceived as complicated, if it's perceived as hard to follow, if in fact if it's perceived as not being the right business language, then in fact there is a cultural risk that examples of the type you can see on this page actually start to create impediments to being the architect, the example I started with, and actually descales the business architecture, because in fact you start to build, because there starts to be almost a resistance in the organization to this happening. Now, I guess like any perhaps growing business architecture practice, not every project is a blinding success. And yeah, and absolutely, there are these questions that come up from time to time. But I think the reason for putting them here, just I guess to acknowledge the reality that perhaps we all live in from time to time, is that this almost reinforces that need to think about culture and to think about the steps we're taking beyond just the specific piece of architectural work that we're all engaged with currently, but how to scale those efforts and make the practices and the methods and the thinking transparent and easy to consume for those around you, not just those that you might immediately interact with. So just before going into the specific examples of what we're doing to influence culture, I did just want to set it, if I could just go on to the next slide, please. Just go into let's just ground that in kind of what is our intended outcome in terms of a business architecture practice. So this is a 5-stage strategy execution path from the BizBot guide, and I guess it's no accident that business architecture has a role to play in each of the stages that you can see on the screen here, from establishing and refining strategy to assessing the business impact of that strategy, to architecting the business solution, establishing initiative plans, and deploying the solution. And in terms of our own particular business architecture practice at Schroders and our intended outcomes, we see ourselves as having a role to play in every one of those stages. Having said that, we are also conscious that we have been from the start of our efforts, that we need a place to start. And therefore what we've done, you can see that shading on the top of the diagram, we have absolutely started with directly supporting strategic programs of the type I was referring to a couple of slides back, like Project Swift, we've done a large investment take on, like streamlining our product development processes and value streams, like thinking through regulatory initiatives. And we've used those opportunities, being the architects, as examples, and I'll talk about this later when I get into the detail around the culture change, of building that trust in the kind of maybe the latter stages of the model you can see on this page. And essentially our aspirations, our intended outcome, is to enable, we believe that organizational, as it says at the bottom there, plays a key role in enabling us to move from right to left on the diagram. So we are not going to be able to get into the role of a seat at the table in terms of supporting those who are setting strategy if there isn't a broad acceptance of the underlying thinking, the success, the track record, the credibility of business architecture across a whole number of stakeholders. And therefore we see the role that organizational culture plays in bringing that acceptance and that trust beyond the individual examples of where we're able to apply it, as ultimately helping our cause to gain the best outcomes we believe for the organization by actively partnering business architecture at the different intersection points along this diagram. So we believe there's great value in applying business architecture in deploying solutions and in projects and programs. We believe there's great value in applying business architecture in strategically planning for the change, the portfolio of change that an organization goes through. We also believe there's great value in establishing and refining strategy. And to help us do that right to left transition, which I understand other organizations go through as well, we think organizational culture has a huge role to play in that. So I'll now come on to the main content of the presentation in the next slide. And this is now coming in, this really now gets to the point about, so therefore what role does company culture play in our approach? And you can see there are some pretty deliberate words that I've used here, starting with our kind of cultural aspiration really on the left-hand side, which is ultimately all we are trying to do is to create a positive environment for business architecture to flourish. And coming back to some of those comments I was making about the iceberg, as much as we accept and are very mindful of the fact that that's about ultimately influencing groups of people, it's ultimately going to come down to how individuals feel about the way in which business architecture works or possibly doesn't work for them. And so ultimately this does come down to feelings, and therefore it's, and I'll go through each of these points on the following slide. It's about first and foremost making sure that business architecture feels useful. It must feel useful. If it doesn't feel useful, nothing else really matters, and therefore we must have abilities and ways to make sure that the business architecture feels practically useful to people. It's also really important that people feel listened to and individuals feel listened to, because there's nothing worse than a business architecture which has been not adapted, that doesn't feel fit for purpose for an organization, that doesn't take account of change in a thoughtful way, that doesn't align practices across different architecture disciplines. It also needs to feel safe to use, just to think back to some of those points in the iceberg about people's needs for safety. And when there's a new concept or a new way of working, it's sometimes a little scary and it feels a little unfamiliar. And until you've given people a safe environment in which to practice, in which, dare I say, to make a little mistake here or there, it's not going to feel safe enough for them to use, to then be prepared to vouch for it and apply it independently themselves. And lastly, it needs to feel familiar. So going back to this kind of strap line that business architecture is this single connected language to accelerate and de-risk change. One of the great uses of business architecture, value streams, product maps, capability maps, information maps, is that you can then apply them in lots and lots of different ways. And by making sure that you're using a variety of different methods to communicate, to showcase, to deliver value from your business architecture materials, over time, that familiarity will also create this positive environment for business architecture to flourish. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to spend a little bit of time talking about practical steps we've taken for each of these 4 points. So on the first one about business architecture feeling useful. Now, I guess just to quickly refer back to the iceberg model again, that talks about things which are visible and things that are invisible. And I'm going to try and make appropriate reference to both as I go through these. And this is the first one here. So in terms of business architecture feeling useful, you do actually need, as a business architecture practice, you can't spend all your time thinking about how to go and influence people. It is actually also about making sure you're building those success stories. And all I've really done here on the first page is to basically state our underlying policy for how we allocate our time as individuals. And as you can see there, it's a very simple split. It's literally 50-50. So we engage and we spend half our time directly engaged on change initiatives. So we help with scope definition, we help with impact analysis, we help with design activity, we help with identifying and working out ways to close capability gaps. We spend the other 50% of our time building the practice and the knowledge base. So what does that mean? That means things like change portfolio analysis. It means looking at our core and extended domains and maintaining our knowledge base in our enterprise architecture tool. It's things like training and discipline alignment with other architecture practices. And I'm very conscious that this is a very simple and straightforward point, perhaps on the page. But I guess what the reason for highlighting it in this presentation, it's a very useful guide. I guess it's about acknowledging that there is never a strict day where you spend the morning working on change initiatives and the afternoon building a knowledge base. It's never quite that simple, but it's a very good check and challenge and a very good reminder as a team, particularly a small team, as many business architecture practices are, about whether there's too much time being invested in building the practice and the knowledge base, and or too much time being spent engaged on change initiatives. And there are a couple of other useful things that this approach does. It first of all makes your time on each quite scarce, and it forces you to get clearer about what does a good outcome look like for being engaged as a business architect on a change initiative, because you only have half of your time that's available to be able to devote to it. It also equally therefore gives you a lot of need to focus and prioritize your time about what does building the practice and the knowledge base really look like too, and create almost that roadmap for what are the priorities and the actions we're going to take forward to give us the best outcomes. So what this forces, and going back to the point about culture, what this forces you to do, it forces you to be the architect in terms of the left-hand side, but it also forces you to think about scaling as well. And that's what it does. It frees up that time to allow you to focus on both by acting as that guide about how much time we're allocating between these different tasks. And I guess the final point I was going to make is, as you can see from kind of the graphic, it does sometimes feel as though it's pulling you in two different directions. The real sweet spot is where you can actually build the practice and the knowledge base in the course of engaging on change initiatives, and that's almost where you start to get some real synergy and maximizing the time that you're spending on business architecture. So that's the first thing, feeling useful. If I go on to the next one about stakeholders feeling listened to, I'd say the first thing at the top there about co-creation is we have got most real development of our business architecture models from being directly engaged on those change programs. So the business themselves have a real and immediate change in imperative to get something done, to realize an outcome, to do a big asset take on, to change the way in which product development works, to change the way in which we respond to a regulation. And those are the examples in which, almost with that little bit of time pressure, we can co-create business architecture outcomes really fast. And it's a great example of where we can build mutual trust and respect, because as quickly as we're developing the business architecture content, we're able to apply it and use it to deliver analytical value very fast. So I think that's probably quite a straightforward point. The second one I'd make is perhaps a little less immediate than that, is communities of practice. And I think that our own development over time has been very much started off as a community of practice of business stakeholders, where we're looking to build out the frameworks and the models at the beginning of our efforts and our working together. I think what's happened over time is that as the business architecture has become more embedded and accepted and championed, we've actually amended over time our community of practice to actually align more closely with our IT colleagues, so that we can actually align our disciplines more closely. But what that's allowed for as well is that our IT architecture and other related disciplines, they really feel listened to as well. And it's about how can we adjust and extend our meta models so that the relevant parts of the IT architecture can connect meaningfully to the relevant parts of the business architecture. And the third part, which is almost perhaps the slightly less glamorous side of helping stakeholders feeling listened to, is about change control. And that's a really important point. And that's because as much as you're developing things and you're constantly thinking about change, and you're constantly thinking about what are stable models but are sometimes ripe for making improvements to, you've got to make sure that you are linking back and you're keeping all your stakeholders who've been involved in the development of your models up to speed with what the latest versions are. And that's, I would say, that is in part an administrative process, but it is actually a backstop, and it really helps to build that trust with stakeholders, that they can provide that input to the development of your business architecture safe in the knowledge that it will stay, and they will have an opportunity to go through the process of change together, and build something that's even better in the next versions going forward. The third piece, and I guess just to quickly refer to the photos you're seeing in these slides, I'm giving you a virtual tour of our London offices as we go through this. The business architecture needs to feel safe to use, and I guess, you know, a couple of quick points to make here. So first of all, I guess kind of something I've heard which I quite like. I mean, we have I think I mentioned earlier 5,500 people on our organisation roughly, and I guess in practice I've heard someone say, well, you have the same number of business architects in your organisation, because the reality is we all have our own mental models of how the business works. And I guess one of the reasons we were interested in introducing standards is that we were very keen in essentially professionalizing what business architecture actually meant. And I think what that's enabled us to do is to very much accelerate what we're doing, because if a question has come up about the relationship between business architecture and scaled agile, or business architecture and customer experience, or business process management, or I mean, I guess I could go on. But the fact that the standards exist, the fact that there is an army of people, of which I guess I am now one also, also in volunteering to spend their time improving the standard and make it available to others, has really helped. Because what it means when we join the conversations in a new part of our business that we've not worked with before is that it's a very simple conversation that says we're applying a set of standards, we're making them fit for purpose in our organization, they work, we've proved that they worked, and it takes care of the conversation quite quickly. This is not an approach which we're making up as we go along. It's about making it an external professional standard fit for purpose in what we're trying to do. And I guess that's very important, particularly when we think about moving up that curve of getting more influence in terms of areas like strategy, which are of great importance to the company. The second thing about feeling safe to use, and I've talked about that safe environment, we have done a mixture of things in terms of helping colleagues attend externals training in these standards. What we have also done is to create a much more practical version of our training, of a training course that we deliver internally, where colleagues spend most of about the course of a day developing the business architecture for a restaurant. And what that allows them to do is to get really comfortable and really familiar with what an information concept is, capability, value stream, and how that contributes to the success and strategic direction of a made-up organization. And that, I think, has really helped the penny drop with different communities across our business, and is something that we've got a lot of success from. And the last piece is about discipline alignment, and that feeling safe to use is about how do we work really closely with our data architecture teams, with our IT architects, and we align those disciplines in a way where they bring their own standards to the table, we bring ours, and by linking them up in thoughtful ways, we build that trust, and we make the business architecture feel safe to use for those communities as well. And the last area about making the business architecture feeling familiar. So I guess these are some examples on the page that I mentioned, that I referred to earlier. So business impact assessments, value streams organized into common business scenarios, business goals and objectives linked to the business architecture, information maps linked to data architecture, business capability and application mapping. And I guess for those who are familiar with the Business Architecture Guild standards, these are pretty common ways of exposing your business architecture and joining it up in sensible ways, to other parts of the business and the IT landscape. And over time, by seeing common business capabilities and value streams and information referred to in common ways, people build that familiarity. And I guess just to go on to the final slide then, what that does is, just to recap, is through the combination of those methods, from making sure the business architecture feels useful, almost that medical principle that no one is above practicing, by continuing to stay involved through that 50-50 allocation, by really making sure the business feels listened to in the development of their architecture, by making it feel safe to use through the application of a recognized standard, through training, through discipline alignment, and by having that constant repetition of the same content displayed in different ways to support different business outcomes. We feel as though and are experiencing that the combination of those things adds up to creating that positive environment for our business architecture to flourish, and ultimately, as I've been referring to, helps us to move from right to left on that strategy execution path. So it's a journey. I guess I'm mindful not to paint it in too rosy a picture. I would hopefully be the first to admit that we have not made every perfect step along the way of this journey, and I hope I've been able to illustrate the distinction between perhaps at times the role of being the architect and what it might take and what it does take to start to scale the architecture. And I'm hoping that at least one of the ideas I've been able to share in this presentation gives some food for thought, and hopefully gives you something positive to think about and take on and consider applying yourselves. And I'd be delighted to answer any questions. Thank you.
So thank you, Ian. That's been really good. The four steps in your approach, I think that was really great. But I will tell you, the slide that impressed me the most was the questions that make you cringe as a business architect. So I have to ask, what do you respond to when somebody says, my department is not in the capability map?
Well, I tell you what, well, first of all, thank you. And it's a great question that whenever it comes up, and I think, I don't know, I suppose as I was trying to refer to when I went through the content earlier, it's all of these the times where these types of questions come up. I hope I'm not descending into cliche by saying that they're teachable moments, and I don't refer to them as teachable moments in the moment, but what I typically do is I ask whoever it is who's raised the question, tell me more about what the department do. What department are we talking about? Are we talking about the finance department? Okay, so what are the things that the finance department really needs to be able to do? Well, the finance department, depending on how they cut things, they're going to be involved in financial control. They're going to be involved in tax. They're going to have perhaps some treasury responsibility, and what you can then get into where they're going to be preparing financial statements. And what you can then do is to say, well, in fact, actually, the purpose of a business capability map is to show cross-functional impact of all of these things. So let's take financial statements as an example. As much as it's important for a finance department to be involved in the production of financial statements, you are likely to also have involvement from your corporate secretariat team. You're likely to have involvement from different business lines who are preparing business level numbers. And what you're really, it's therefore, in my experience, mostly an opportunity to see that actually departments and capabilities are at right angles to each other and actually help you to build a matrix and a much clearer view as to what the business is really capable of. And it doesn't always work, but yeah, I tend to avoid at all costs any commitments to adding a departmental name to a capability.
No, absolutely. And it's a question a lot of architects get in a lot of their roadmaps and business capability mapping as well. So yeah. Let me show you a question that's popped up from Michael Park. In his opinion, you're describing a lean value stream and not a business architecture value stream. So business architecture is at the level of what, not how. Lean value streams get to the how.
Okay. I guess I haven't really. I mean, firstly, I'm really glad that this question has got raised. I suppose I have made reference in the presentation to value streams. I mean, just for clarity's sake, I mean the value domain of business architecture, and I'm conscious of the fact that value stream is a term that's shared, I guess, between like the operational excellence discipline, I guess, that the lean kind of meaning of it, versus how business architecture refers to it. I guess I haven't really shared much by way of example, but the ways in which we have, I think I might have referred to it in terms of product development and referring to processes. Essentially, the role to get a little more specific about the way in which we've applied it. One of the practical ways that we've been able to get value from the business architecture application of the concept of value streams is by almost doing things as almost as mundane as organizing the requirements elicitation workshops that our business analysts ran, organized by the value stream stages. So the value stream stages and the entry and the exit criteria acted as fantastic bookends of what had to happen each of those in that product development value stream. In terms of how that happened, that was very much the remit and the responsibility of the business analysts and those technical experts to work out how the process was going to work within it. So I appreciate the question. I guess we are very focused on the business architecture approach to value streams. We also have an operational excellence team in the business. We work very closely together. but we're very keen on making sure that distinction is clear with our own stakeholders.
Great. So you've talked about kind of the organizational part. Can you talk a little bit about the building of the integration and relationship, as you put it, trust between the business architecture team and the other IT architecture groups?
Yeah,
How do they
absolutely.
work with the IT architects on a day-to-day basis?
Yeah, we do. We absolutely do. I think what I'd say is that our focus very much initially has been prioritizing, I guess, building useful business architecture materials and outputs for business stakeholders. It has become because of that acceptance and that support that we've got, and applying it practically from the get-go. I think that's brought with it an appreciation and an opportunity to work more closely with our IT architecture colleagues, who are fantastic. I think the point I was making earlier in the presentation about sometimes it's that little bit of that pressure cooker sometimes of being on a project where things need to happen quickly, and that's often been the spark of that real collaboration between ourselves and our IT architecture colleagues, where actually we need to show a joined up end-to-end view of how a particular objective or something we deliver externally connects through to our business processes, our buildings, our people, our suppliers, our technology, and our data. And those require mappings on our enterprise architecture tool that we're not able to do ourselves, and are practical ways that we must collaborate between ourselves and our IT architecture colleagues and our data architecture colleagues. I think we are now starting to explore not just the how do we sync up and collaborate where we must, but how can we now maximize the potential of having linked, for example, our IT application estate to our business capabilities, because there's so much that we can gain from that in a more strategic sense than maybe we've been able to do so far. So I think we've probably got more to go down that road, but lots of good opportunities.
Okay. All right then. We don't have any more questions in the chat.
Okay.
Do you have any final comments you'd like to share?
No, I mean, I guess I just wanted to kind of repeat again, really. Thank you again. I personally think I guess I had a choice to make in considering maybe what to put forward as presentation material this time, and I'm hoping that some consideration of just the broader environment in which business architecture can grow, and it's like there's a because of all of what we do every day, there's that kind of tendency to think about the immediate and the present and the here and now. And I guess some of what I've been trying to communicate and get across is just having that think about how are we influencing things more generally. And I'm hoping to have offered some practical ways to kind of start to work through that. Ultimately helps business architects, other architects and other disciplines to take something from this and hopefully get something practical and useful themselves.
Okay. And I will share with you, I guess the audience think you've been very inspiring, as do I.
That's very kind. I really appreciate that. Thank you.
Okay.